For today's meeting, we are very pleased to welcome Anna Wilkening, Ian McCallum, and Velma Nicholas, who will speak about their project on collaborative interpretation of Moravian Munsee Lenape manuscripts and ancestral voices at Harvard's Houghton Library. Focused on 18th and 19th century Moravian manuscripts written in Munsee Lenape and German, this project brought together Munsee scholars and community members, a German graduate student, and ancestral archives in a shared effort to support Munsee language and cultural revitalization. And now I will introduce our three presenters. Anna Wilkening is a PhD candidate in the study of religion with a secondary concentration in women, gender, and sexuality studies at Harvard University. She is originally from the Swabian region of southwestern Germany. Anca's doctoral research integrates queer theory, Indigenous and colonialism studies, and early American and Atlantic history, centering on the intersections of religion, intimacy, and kin-making among Mohican, Lenape, European, and African actors in early Moravian communities. She is committed to the ethics of ongoing learning of community-engaged research as a non-Indigenous scholar on Native land, collaborating with Indigenous leaders and community members to examine how research can be conducted in good relation with Indigenous sovereign nations and how it can support Indigenous futures, including cultural revitalization efforts. Velma Nicholas, whose real name is Medweana Kwedokwe, is of the Turkey clan of the Eulunapewi Lakewit. She currently serves as the cultural coordinator within her community, and her work includes archival, documentation, and repatriation duties, as well as providing relevant cultural programming for community growth and education. She has been an Ontario certified teacher for 17 years and has worked in all areas and levels of education. She began her language learning journey as a college student and hasn't looked back since. She graduated from Lakehead University with a native language instructor's diploma in 2009. Following this, she attended Queen's University to complete a diploma in education. She holds a Bachelor's of Arts in Social Sciences, majoring in Indigenous Studies, and currently she is a master's student in Language Revitalization program at the University of Victoria. And last but not least, Ian McCallum is a member of the Munsee Delaware First Nation. He works with his community promoting culture and history and is an educator working with the Munsee language. As a PhD student at the University of Toronto, Ian is currently researching strategies to support Munsee language revitalization. His most current work looks at connections between the Munsee language, the Thames River, and the Carolinian forest ecosystem. Ian is an education officer in the Indigenous Education Office for the Ministry of Education in Ontario, and he has worked in the field of education for more than 20 years in the capacity of classroom and resource teacher, as well as supporting teacher candidates as a seconded faculty of education member. So with all of that, I would like to turn the floor over to our presenters today.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share our slideshow, but Ian will get us started. Unfortunately, Velma had a lot of things coming up this week. She might not be able to join us, but if she doesn't, she did share a few things with us that we are just going to put into the presentation, and she's definitely here with us in spirit. All right. All right, there we go. Ian, do you want to take it away?
For sure. Anashik Anca. Well, like Kishwikwamoan, good day, everyone. Nidashinzi Wabanuk. My name is Ian McCallum, and I have the pleasure of starting our show this afternoon, which we've titled Akiinziitookw. So let's read together, and that is That's an interpretation of kind of what Velma, Anca, myself, and others were able to do at the Houghton Library at Harvard. And we're trying to make the connection between using the archives, language revitalization, but looking even deeper than that in terms of what the archives can share with us as that third teacher, what it can provide those who are interested in language revitalization, while at the same time acknowledging that it comes from a colonial environment and that there are also those emotional pieces to work through. I thought what would be really important is to sort of set the stage, because I believe that most of the participants aren't from Southwestern Ontario or down the street from me where I live now here in Central Ontario. So it's important to put the context into what language we're working with, but also the homelands of the Munsee people, which Brian touched upon in his land acknowledgements. So if I could have the next slide on, could that be great?
Yeah, absolutely. There you go.
Perfect. So to contextualize where the Munsee language is from originally, I guess, what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw your attention to the map that's on this slide, and it highlights areas of the eastern seaboard, from the Hudson River just north of New York City, all the way down to Philadelphia, the area of Philadelphia, and that's the homeland for not only the Munsee people, but also the Unami people as well, which formed that larger group of people that the English referred to as the Delaware. And of course, due to conflict over the ensuing 300 years between first contact with Henry Hudson and to present day in our meeting this afternoon, the Munsee people and the Unami people have been dispersed. So that's how we have 3 communities here in Southwestern Ontario, and that there's also communities out in Oklahoma and Kansas. But the original homelands was around New York City, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. And just to provide the context of kind of what my current work is and how archives can support, the picture to the right is of the Millstone River in New Jersey. And it just sort of provides that the land connections for the Munsee people, sort of water connections as well, and how the archives can support the work that we do in terms of land-based and language revitalization. Next slide, please. And again, if you're not from Southwestern Ontario, here's a bigger sort of digital map that we use with the Ministry of Education. It highlights the language diversity in our province, with bigger groups, bigger communities like Six Nations, where the Haudenosaunee languages are, but we also have Ojibwe speaking communities, Anishinaabe speaking communities. We have Munsee speaking communities. We have communities that speak Oneida language. So the diversity within our province is vast, and at the same time, we have 3 Munsee speaking communities all within this mix. So that's in an area that's fairly small. You have a lot of languages that are present. Next slide, please. So I thought I'd share a couple of pictures of the Thames River that connects my community, Munsee, Delaware, with Velma's community, Elnapawi-Lakwit. Back in the day, we used to call it Moravian Town for obvious reasons in this presentation. That was the Moravian community that was established by the missionaries in 1792. Munsee, Delaware predates Moravian Town by at least 5 to 8 years. We have records of the missionaries welcoming the extra corn that was coming from our community downriver when they first started to establish their village. But this gives you a picturesque view of the river that would have connected both my community, well, still connects my community and Velma's. And that was that vital transportation link between the two, but also to the much larger trading posts at Detroit. And that's also the basis of my work currently, looking at the trees and the plants along the river and how closely connected it is back to our homelands in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. to make further connections for everyone, our community does have a language class. For the last 10 years, both myself and my colleague Karen Dolson, we provided the language learning programming for our community. With Karen's passing in 2023, I have carried on as best I can. I do live 2.5 hours away from my reserve. So it's basically comes down to once a month, or if I'm in town, hey, there's a language class. But I thought I'd share some pictures of the actual learning that's going on that's, that essentially is very timely. Here in Ontario, it's planting moon. So we would get together and we do a seed exchange, but all of this is done as much as we can in the language. We are all second language speakers, second language learners on my community. We do not have any first language speakers remaining. So the content has to be very much driven by community interest. And then you also incorporate language, history, and culture into that. It's not an immersive environment. We'll get there, probably not in my generation, but my kids' generation. But we do what we can to bring people through the door to want to learn language and also grab some history, culture, geography, science at the same time. So this is just the interior of our band office. They give us that for our language class. To further that, we also do quite a bit of translation work to try and build up our resources for community. This is a selection of the resources that I've had the pleasure of working on. The one to the left is a story that was given by a community member at large who lives in the Netherlands, but he gave us the first kiss of the snow. So we translated that and presented that to the community and worldwide in December of last year. The other images to the other side are family stories from my family were captured in English. And what we do is I don't know if the words repatriate back into the language. But again, they're all, in the case of several of these stories, they're older documents that are found in newspapers or found written down that somebody recorded in English. And what we do then is we translate those back, sort of highlighting the fact that while history has a lot of pain and suffering towards the Munsee people, we've gone through our trials and tribulations, that print resources, those things that have been recorded by non-Indigenous people are also helpful in terms of supporting language revitalization. Next slide. Well, I'm doing a lot of talking here. Anyways, I'll continue. This just provides a little bit of a history snapshot. The building on the left is actually my family building. It was built probably in the 1840s. It supported 3 generations of my family before it was given off to the Dolson family. But it also highlights the transition from how we used to live in the buildings of the Lenape, the Munsee people, and what we transferred into, which would be somewhat similar to the settlers that came to southwestern Ontario. So those are typical of the buildings that Munsee people would have lived in from about 1840 onwards. The key thing with this is that when you walk into that building, what you notice is that this is a building that would have gradually learned English. And I think that I'm trying to make the correlation between the fact that you have something that's a physical structure that can't speak to you. But when you go into that building, you're immediately immersed into the fact that everybody in my family who had gone in there would have known the Munsee language, and that English would have been the foreign language. And that those trees on the outside of that building are more familiar with the Indigenous languages than they are English, because English has only been here for 300 years. But Munsee, whether it be Munsee or whether it be Ojibwe, whether it be Potawatomi, those languages have been part of something that's been spoken in Ontario, but also at large for many more years. We get into the crux now, and I think this slide. Oh, we go back. I think Anca.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. This gets into the crux of what Anca and I are going to talk about. And if Velma comes on, this is the piece. We're looking to specifically at language now, and I thought we'd share what resources do we have right now. For my community, we have access to a dictionary. It was put together by John O'Meara, and there's other people that have worked on it. Worked on language resources, specifically Munsee. Ives Goddard, Miles Beckwith have all done some really strong work. They've gone and interviewed people from the 1960s onwards to try and capture as much Munsee language as they could. So we have a comprehensive dictionary. Doesn't have everything, right? So that's where the archives can come in. We have missing words, and community will reach out and say, well, what is the word for this? So that's our first go-to resource. If we can't find it there, we can go to our own community people who wrote stuff back in the 1850s, Charles Half Moon, John Wampum, who translated the Anglican Book of Hymns or catechisms. We actually have a copy of the original hymn book from 1850. It's amazing. And that came from Karen Dolson's collection. So we do have community resources. People were actively translating. People who spoke English would translate the language. We have a pretty good, baseline for language work. Next slide, please. So key questions that you can consider while Anca and I are going to go through this piece about work with the archives is, I would strongly recommend that the archives can support language revitalization. And there's lots of conversation about that in Indigenous communities, because of course, once you walk into an institution, you have to reconcile what has happened in the past. So while it might be a slam dunk for Billy, of course, the archives are, of course, you can learn from the archives. For Indigenous peoples, just getting through that threshold, you have to acknowledge whose voice is being used in the archives, who wrote things down, how they interpreted them. But you also have to work through, a community's worth of, potential harm from the past. I would argue that the archives is a wonderful third teacher. So in the classroom, we use that, the teacher, the person speaking, you got the printed materials, but you also have what's on the walls. And I'd argue that the archive is an example of that third teacher, much like the land is that, well, it could be used as a primary teacher, but it's also a third teacher in terms of sharing its knowledge with you. Is there colonialism involved? Absolutely. But is there also community voice? So when we get past the fact that an oral language has been written down, is there that community voice that can permeate through the text? So you actually have ancestors, you have community people actually talking to you through those books. So you hear those community members' voices. The land-based vocabulary and learning permeates through the text. So there's those strong connections with how the Munsee people would have learned traditionally, where we were put in classrooms and there's a chalkboard and there's a smartboard and there's pens and paper. And then I'm a firm believer in this, and I believe that in those times of trouble, community members hid clues for us in the future to find. So whether that be through the archives, whether that be through the physical items that came from communities, if it's clues where people gave up items and they put a little note so that other people would interpret it in the future, I believe that when you go to archives, when you go to museums, you find these hidden messages. And hopefully we'll make those connections for you as we go forward.
I think I'm going to take over, Ian. Thank you so much, Anishik, for the introduction and kind of setting priorities. Yeah, I'm just going to give you just a little bit of snippet of an introduction to this Moravian mission history and how it connects to these archives. It's definitely not our focus today. And getting a little bit into what we did at Houghton, and then Ian will also jump back in. But the Moravians, or the Moravian Church, came out of a Protestant pietist movement in 18th century Central Europe, where I'm from. You definitely do not need the full history of the Moravians right now, but what I think is important to know for this context is that they're one of the earliest Protestant groups to send missionaries kind of across the globe. And then in the 1730s, they started mission work in North America, seeking to evangelize indigenous communities, kind of enwrapped in empire and colonialism. But in the 1740s, they were specifically among Mohican and Lenape communities, actually were able to establish quite a few congregations, either in some cases that in already existing like towns, forts, and villages, and in some cases also in mission towns that they built and where community members moved in and kind of lived in this really interesting way of kind of living in an indigenous community way, but also bringing in Moravian traditions. The early Moravian missionary enforcers are really characterized by very close linguistic and cultural engagement. As part of their work, they really wanted to learn the language so they could teach in the language, and they also wanted Hiken and Lenape ancestors to kind of pray and read and do liturgies in their own language. And so there was a big like in the 18th and then also early 19th century, there's a big push among Moravians to create dictionaries and hymnals and religious texts. And these kind of translations were often produced obviously in collaboration with community members, with indigenous community members. We know a few of them. I'm kind of looking into this more and more, who were the indigenous workers on these manuscripts, because credit is now given mostly to white male missionaries, and also because I and many other people who know this also know their handwriting pretty well. It's like easier for us to identify who the missionary is who wrote this rather than the person who would have actually given them the knowledge that they were writing down. And also missionary women were actually often in collaboration with indigenous women, also doing quite a lot of language work in Moravian missions, and also they again don't really get any credit either. So it's the women and indigenous people who don't really get the credit for the work, as per usual. Some of these at Harvard specifically, I'll get into that a little bit more. Some of them actually were later on published and printed, but some of these manuscripts are also very much kind of, you could think about them as field notes, like every day little scribbles of someone learning a language and making sense of it in like their own ways of knowing. So right here you see kind of a essay that's mostly written in German that has kind of tried to break down Lenape grammar into ways that make sense in regards to kind of like different cases to someone who would whose primary language would be German. Yeah, and just a little bit about my research approach and what I'm doing. So I actually I did not start out in my project and my research at all thinking I was going to do indigenous studies. I was looking at pietists and Moravians in early America, and then Mohican and Lenape people ended up being all over the archives and also producing the archives that I was studying. This was about 10 years or 8 years ago now. And then, I kind of had to really shift about my methodology, my research approach, and thinking about if I do this work, how am I going to do this in a way that is ethical and is going to matter to communities? So some people here who might be familiar with Indigenous studies scholars might know Sean Wilson's research as ceremony. So I really started to thinking about, how he challenges conventional research models that are kind of more individualistic and constructivist, and that fail to engage meaningfully Indigenous knowledge systems and also Indigenous community needs. So he offers this Indigenous research paradigm grounded in ways of being and knowing and valuing and doing. And at the heart of this approach is the idea that research should not be detached, but form a form of ceremony with other people. And so like Indigenous ceremonies that aim to restore balance and strengthen relationships, research then becomes a sacred act of one being rooted in preparation and intention and participation and transformation. So engaging with Lenape and Mohican nations and building relationships with community members and knowledge keepers and tribal officials has become a kind of central and meaningful part of my research. So while I certainly spent a lot of time in archives and collections, I spent much more time engaging with people and communities who are still living and thriving, more than I think I would have ever as an aspiring historian of early American religion. I would have not imagined this at the beginning of my graduate journey, but it's been a really fantastic journey. But then moving kind of beyond these admittedly foundational steps of ethical kind of engagement, a truly collaborative research model requires reimagining scholarship as a reparative and relational process. So one that acknowledges historical and extractive harm while actively working towards healing and renewal and co-creating research in ways that center Indigenous agency and priorities and perspectives. And so this project in its small stages is one of that. A few other things that I've just done is like I've visited sites and collections with community members, and for instance, the Houghton and Schönbrunn village sites during the Day of Remembrance of the 1782 massacre of Indigenous Moravian, Lenape and Mohican congregants, and then also been visiting in Ontario quite a bit, both Ian's community and also Velma's community for their powwows a few times. So yeah. So how this all came together was, as we know, we have these manuscripts, but they are in a way not really accessible, like a lot of, especially even the Houghton collection, they're not necessarily, they weren't even like digitized or even really put online in a good reading aid until just a couple of years ago. And in the mid-19th century, an Ohio judge named Ebenezer Lane acquired this collection from, we don't really like, I don't really still fully know, but I think it's because the missions were closed and Moravian was kind of moving on, and he saw this. He was a Harvard graduate. He's like, oh, this is maybe important. So he purchased them and then did what a lot of people who went to Harvard do, which is donates them to his alma mater. And so then Harvard president Edward Everett deemed himself responsible for assessing the nature of these papers and doing what he described as, quote, the best he could do to arrange them properly before having them bound into several volumes. And a somewhat later note from a librarian adds that a philologist would probably find that President Everett's decision-making in like editorial decision-making was probably not exactly correct. This is now preserved at Harvard as the Delaware Language Collection in 20 volumes. They have remained largely hidden away in the library repositories since 1850. Not a lot of people have worked with them. And nowhere in the notes or in the correspondence in any history of this related to collection does it appear that Harvard University administration ever considered whether to inquire and consult with contemporary Lenape people or even like Moravian constitutions about these papers and their origin. So I think that our visit was probably the first time that Munsee people have actually been with these archives again in a very long time. Yeah, and so at a NASA, Native American Indigenous Studies Association conference, I connected with Ian. We'd already kind of known each other online from language classes. And I mentioned the collection, and then we began to wonder if these materials could support language and cultural vitalization. And we decided to kind of collaborate, and then brought in Susan and Velma from the Delaware Nation at Moravian Town. And then in March 2024, we gathered at Houghton Library for a week-long research visit. And we were really grateful because the Canada program at the Harvard Weatherhead Center for International Relations actually provided us with funding, which I think is actually really beautiful, because that is exactly what an international relations center should be doing, is bring in Indigenous sovereign nations as researchers and as representatives. Yeah, Ian, do you have anything to add there before I go to the next slide?
Well, nothing other than like your point's well taken, that those books, the language probably hadn't been read by either someone who spoke German or Munsee in whatever 200 years, right? Almost 200 years.
I'm sure there was a German here and there, but Munsee probably not. Yeah. Yeah. So anyone who knows or has spent time in reading room, which I'm sure there's a few people on this call, knows that archives usually operate under very strict rules. You register with your ID, you handle only a few items at a time, mostly just one. You don't have any bags or pens, and you're usually also always working kind of in silence on an individual table in a large observed reading room next to other people on your seat. And these materials prioritize the preservation, and these rules prioritize the preservation of the materials, but they don't always align with community-based relational research and needs, especially you know, when it comes to Indigenous engagement with these materials. And so when we were preparing for our visit at the library, I knew that we were going to see how much we can challenge some of those protocols. And with the help of supportive librarians and many long email threads, we advocated for access to a private room with a librarian supervising us and permission to work with the full collection at once rather than just pulling individual volumes. And it's just making sure that they were with us, the entire collection was with us the entire time. And this allowed us to read aloud, to think collaboratively, and to hold space for dialogue without fear of disrupting others, also being overheard in some cases. In some moments, it also got very emotional. And so it was just kind of a little bit a better space to do all of that. And this shift in kind of the space really allowed us to engage differently with the materials. I'm sure Ian has some more to add for that in a second, but we experimented with different seating arrangements and ways of reading. So for instance, at some point, we gathered, you can see this in one of the pictures here, around a small corner table, and Velma and Susan were on either side of me. And then I read the manuscript, kind of translating the German, and Velma and Susan would kind of identify familiar and unfamiliar Munsee words, and then reconstructing the phrases in contemporary spelling, like on their sheets. And what unfolded was not just a reading of, I would say, historical documents, but a collective act of remembering and reclaiming these archives. They were shaped by both Indigenous and missionary ancestors, and I would say they very much became part of this ceremony of repair, teaching us how to sit together, how to ask questions, how to listen, and we found ourselves in conversation, not just with each other, but definitely also with these 18th century and 19th century ancestors who shaped these manuscripts. So we really don't see them just as linguistic records, but as like kind of living traces of ancestral dialogue. And engaging with them in this way, at least for me, was probably one of the most profound ways of ever engaging an archive. And I will just add Velma's message here and then let Ian give his perspective. She says, spending time with the archives proved to be an emotional experience. My heart was touched to see old language, which made me think of my ancestors. And how, if not for them, I would not be here today. It showed me the history of my people and almost felt a gentleness from them, by them, from the ancestors, by reading the words written down. There were words and phrases that I've never heard before and that aren't being used today. It became a reminder from the ancestors to say, don't forget us. So I saw it as a beginning time for me in what the language was like that was being spoken at the time, how it has shifted and changed and almost to a point where we no longer speak those sacred words. This is emotional for me because I love my language so much and I will do whatever I can to make sure it becomes stable and strong again. Ian, do you have anything to add?
Sure. Yeah, and for everyone on the call today, something that's really important that's happening in these pictures is that that Velma and Susan, who are from Moravian town El Napawi Lakwit, are accessing these documents that would have affected their direct families. And I was remiss to mention that the difference between the two communities, mine and Moravian town, is that we were not connected with the Moravians. We were what you would call a heathen community. So what happened between the two communities is that while the community at Moravian town would be under the Moravian missionaries, the people living there would come up to our community for the old traditional religion fix at times. And there's lots of things that permeate the missionaries' documents that sort of are not, they're not thrilled that their flock is going to our community to go back to the old ways. But what's really important here is that there's community representation that is accessing those language resources that would have directly impacted their community. And I think that's that sovereignty piece, that every Indigenous community has its own unique history. In some cases, a unique dialect of the language. But what's critical here is that both Velma and Susan were able to spend the time and represent their community in that colonial space, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. One memory that was really imprinted on me was when Velma was talking about being in, like museum, like kind of material collections, and handling objects, and how she often gets a feeling, like a certain sense when it's an ancestral object and kind of a connection. And she said when she was holding some of these books, that's exactly how she felt. It's exactly the kind of the impression that she got. Yeah. Yeah, and then we just have a few examples for you, just give you a little bit of an idea of what we actually found. This is, and also to get a little bit of idea what the manuscripts look like. I know that the bottom one here, Ian is very excited about, so I'm gonna give him that one.
Yeah, and I think this really highlights having someone who can understand the German language right next to you, right? Because you're reading, the documentation that was done by German missionaries. But you can also sort of hear the Munsee and the German language, the similarities, or start to think about what impact the German language has had on the Munsee language in terms of written material. So the bottom, I mean, the bigger picture on this screen sort of is what we were looking through. After a day in the archives, my eye prescription changed, right? Because that's the strain. But I mean, a wonderful experience. But one of the words that jumped off the page at me in this one was the word for comb. And the word for comb in Munsee is chichichen. And if you move to the far right-hand side, very bottom right-hand side, you can sort of see how it's been written by the German missionary, and you can almost hear it. And of course, having Anca beside me, she's able to not only translate into the German, but she's also able to read the script of the missionary, which is so very helpful. So that was one of those key words that was a no doubter. I think when it comes to language revitalization, you're looking through archives, you see one of these words that you instantly recognize because you could hear it, you can see it, even though it may have been written in a German script.
Yeah, it's really interesting actually, because I mean, as Ian knows, I definitely have a very thick accent in the little Munsee that I speak, German accent. But with these manuscripts, they were written down by mostly German speakers. So if I actually kind of read the Munsee in how I would pronounce it when I just see it, oftentimes it's actually pretty close. So we were just kind of like playing around with that pronunciation a little bit as we're trying to make sense of some of the words. The one that is there in blue that I found just really interesting. Because this kind of tells us a little bit about gender and ideas of gender, especially also among the missionaries. These are two phrases that translate to he looks like a man, and the other one is he looks like a woman. So there's just like some interesting expectations right around gender, and probably also what they were trying to potentially affect. One of our favorite, and like Ian could definitely talk about this more, but this was my favorite one, is the blueberry. So as I was reading through, I just said, oh, this phrase says there are many blueberries. And Velma just like stopped and she grabbed my arm and she said, blueberry, we have been looking for this word for years. And I thought she was making fun of me. I thought that she was not serious. She was playing like, I'm going to play a trick on this like German girl. And then she was like, no, I'm actually serious. And so we found this word for blueberry, and also blueberry bread and blueberry drink. And yeah, the next day we kind of like celebrated by having like some blueberries in our breakfast before we went back to the archives. But many of there are many land-based terms in the notebooks that speak to the importance of plants and animals to Lenape Moravians and kind of sharing their world and their language with the missionaries. So there's like long lists of all kinds of animals and all of that. And so we were gifted in our collaboration with some of those because they haven't been used or known in the same way for a long time, including even this word for blueberry. And then this kind of prompted me to think a little bit more, okay, like what is actually the role of blueberries in these 18th century communities? And in the German missionary diaries from the same period, there are actually references of like the reference to blueberries are as abundant as like a blueberry bush in July. And there are a lot of Mohican and Lenape women who are frequently mentioned being absent from the mission post while gathering blueberries. It's also kind of this way to like get away from the community. But blueberries are often recorded as an essential sustenance during frequent food shortages, particularly cherished in times of famine and migration when communities relied on these berries, sometimes as the only food source available, and also often drying and preserving them, sustain them kind of like year round on these trips. And so I think that's a really interesting, way of like thinking about why is this blueberry mentioned in there, and why there's so many mentions to blueberry. Yeah, and Ian can talk a little bit about what this means moving forward.
Certainly, thanks, Anca. And I don't mean to just to pick a fight on our lovely Zoom call, but there are some linguists that would argue that the Munsee language is actually the ancestor of the Ojibwe language. So when it comes to language revitalization work, I'm just going to leave that out there. If there's any Ojibwe speakers on the call, I apologize firsthand. But in language revitalization work, oftentimes you might get someone say, well, why not take a look at the Ojibwe version of blueberry? And maybe the Munsee word was close because our languages are related. And while that's great and all, there's going to be those differences that happen. So when this word came to fruition out of the jumping off the page, it really did solve a big question that we get in communities, because blueberries are still a very important piece for people. We get asked this word all the time, right? And from community members, well, what's the word for blueberry? We got the word for strawberry, but we don't know the word for blueberry. So this was an incredible find because it does answer a very topical question for people, especially coming up into June, July, and August when the blueberries are ripe up here. Anca mentioned that it does highlight the role responsibilities as well, because of course now we have a firm understanding that blueberries were present in both possibly Pennsylvania, possibly New Jersey, possibly New York. Not the high bush and the stuff that's planted, but that they are actually part of the diet of the people at that time as well. And then it also then talks about seasonal practices. And it comes back to the rivers, it comes back to the ecology and the environment, that blueberries remain that staple. But how did the people go to like a summer camp, right? Where they would have picked the blueberries, then come back to the main village where they had their planted crops. So it does sort of spark that further interest in how Munsee people were fairly mobile during the year to access the things that they needed.
Yeah. There's like, we have a few other examples. I'll let you start with this one and then just add.
Sure. So it's amazing when you're on the same page as someone. So Anca and I met earlier this week, and I said I was going to use Wapakish for the ginseng root, and she immediately started. We talked for more than an hour. We didn't really get to what we were supposed to do because there was so much information about just one word, and I think this is what the archives does. So looking at these documents, looking at that word Wapakish for ginseng root, we don't have that in our dictionary, and yet ginseng is very much a very well-known medicine among the Munsee people. So much so up here for the Ojibwe, it's one of those the things that are not very well talked about, because if you mention that you have wild ginseng, that the patch then is going to get overrun by people who pick it to to extinction. So people are very guarded about ginseng here in Ontario. If they've got a patch in their community, you don't talk about it. But here you have a very powerful medicine that's talked about in multiple different ways. What we now have is we have the ability to increase our understanding of the environment through language. And while that it's not minuscule, I guess, because of course the dictionary doesn't provide that. It doesn't provide that extra information that you require. So by finding these words in the archives, in this archival material, we're now able to really formulate a much better view of our environment that the Munsee people lived in, that we can now share with community members, and we can also share with our youth in terms of how to reconnect with land-based knowledge. And that's that third teacher, right? So thanks to Velma Anca for putting in the picture of the ginseng, right? Well, that plant's a teacher, just like this printed material is a teacher, and the person who shared that knowledge with the missionaries is that teacher. So you have teachers around you that are now sharing that knowledge about ginseng root.
Thank you, Ian.
Yeah.
For me, this was also exciting because this was one of the moments where this actually intersected with what I was doing, what I'm doing in my dissertation, because I'm looking at how land-based ways of knowing in like one of the chapters and kind of relationships and kinship relationships with other human beings are still present in these early Moravian indigenous communities. And so medicine made from plants and shared across communities and cultural boundaries was one of the most remarkable like fabrics of that relation building. And early missionaries also supported and aided the use of making these medicines initially, and they often consumed them themselves when they fell ill or were injured. And so usually there was a lot of interest and exchange about this. But then also to like notice about cleansing room, right? The American ginseng became an early case of kind of complicated tensions between resource exploitation and commodification, because in the latter half of the 18th century, settlers commodified and appropriated the plant for international trade, making fortunes and transforming it in one of North America's most lucrative exports, even financing kind of revolutionary war debt and all of that. And it has now been overharvested. And like if you see it, please don't gather it unless you know what you're doing and you're indigenous. But this kind of like really like in the dictionaries and in the also the diaries, we kind of see how important this medicine and other root medicines were like in the day-to-day life of these communities. Then we also found a word for tree. Do you want to talk about that a little bit more, Ian?
Yeah, I think it was on the heels of what's Treaty Week up here in Ontario, which is in November. We usually use the word like making an agreement, but that's not necessarily the entire story behind a treaty. So if you look in our dictionary, there'll be a word for making an agreement, and that's what we tend to use to sort of either translate or to make that understanding of what's going on in Ontario viable or connected to our students. But looking in this again in the archives, you're able to come up with different words for a treaty, and that of course now you've got to go back to the drawing board and pick apart that word to make a better understanding of what that word's going to mean instead of the word that we've been using. So it's it provides more work, I guess, right? And and it's fun work, but you can really go down the rabbit hole to try and pick apart the word to see whether the meaning is the same, right? Or whether there's more to it. And I in this case, I also argue whether that's that person who was interviewed, that's their interpretation of what a treaty is. Right.
Yeah.
And I also don't know, what's the living memory of the people who were talking about this in terms of not only a Moravian Munsee person, but also somebody who may have been witness to those treaties in 1685 with William Penn, or the walking purchase. The translation there may have much more deeper personal, for lack of a better word, anguish, right, in terms of treaties that have gone bad. So, I mean, the word there is yet to be fully broken apart, at least by myself.
Yeah. Speaking of one kind of final example that I found interesting. So as I'm sure also many of you know, sometimes in these like in indigenous languages, right, especially other than human relatives are described in a way that they like look, or like maybe after the sound that they make, or things like that. And also the missionaries sometimes would not know the actual German translation of an animal that they might have learned the word to. They would just see the animal. So this is like one example. There's one translation for a bird, and it just says like in German, a large fisher like an eagle. And then you have to kind of think, oh, is that is it the Munsee word actually that says that, or is it this, the missionary doesn't know what it is, and then we have to kind of look for, okay, what is a large fish that is like an eagle? And it's most likely an osprey, but then kind of also takes us on this like really beautiful journey of like getting to know animals and plants, and doing kind of like diving into that world. Yeah. And I think now Ian is just going to wrap us up to kind of talk a little bit more about how this is going to be integrated, or is being integrated in kind of community learning.
Yeah, so how this works, or how this can inform what we're doing in our community, I'll give you a couple of examples. One is what Brian introduced my research as, in terms of understanding the Carolinian forest, the plants, the trees, the insects, the animals that live within this very unique ecosystem, at least for us in Ontario, because it only incorporates the very southern part of the province. And it's that same environment that holds a lot of the same trees and plants and animals and bugs that's found back in the homelands. And the connection I'm trying to make is that for the Munsee people, we didn't just stop where we did here in Ontario for any particular reason. We knew why we were stopping here. And so we're working on a community path, and one of the things we're having to do is we actually have to do an analysis of what plants are back there. We know there's lots of wood ticks, but we don't want those when we want the actual plants, the trees. We want to have an understanding of what's there before we make this path. The reason being is that we're finding a lot of very endangered species, at least for Southern Ontario, are found on Indigenous communities because they've essentially been left alone. They've been able to regenerate and are able to come back. So that's something that's happening. We've engaged with artists, we've engaged with community chefs, dietitians, language people, history people, who all come together to work on this community path. And that's, it all comes back to the language. There are words, or there are names for these trees that we don't have. So using the archives such as Houghton, we're able now to find those missing pieces. Next slide, on. The archival work also supports an understanding of the homelands. So the picture to the left is a nice paddle out on it's close to the Delaware River. I think Suzanne's on the call, but we put our boats in one of the rivers that's close to Philadelphia, that feed into the Delaware, to have a better understanding of what Munsee people would have seen. And what we have here is actually the wild rice coming back. Wild rice figures in our dictionary. What we also then think about is, is there wild rice close to where we put up our tents here in Ontario? And there's lots of rice lakes here in Ontario, not necessarily close by, but was rice, did it figure into our diet, but also our way of life as we progressed from the eastern seaboard all the way up to Ontario? We find that place names. You want to go back?
Oh yeah, sorry, gosh.
Yeah, no, it's
yeah.
Thanks, Suzanne. Crosswicks Creek, I forgot the name. Can you go back one more? I think it's just the map.
Oh yes, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, the map to the right. What we've started to do here in Ontario is come up with all of the place names that Munsee people had for places. So while it does tend to be dominated by both Ojibwe place names, Ojibwe language place names, and to a lesser degree, Mohawk, and other Haudenosaunee place names. What we're doing now is, because we've lived here for 300 years, we've probably had names for places as well. So we've tried to come up with a map with partnership with the University of Western Ontario to develop this GIS map that our students in our schools can use, but also community members. So if they want to, understand our connection to the land through place name, we'll have that available. We haven't crossed the Niagara River yet, but we're going to, in terms of getting to know more about where the rivers and whatnot that Munsee people travel. The work in Houghton also supports our understanding of how we use the rivers, how we interacted with the environment. So the picture to the left shows giant clamshells in the Thames River. We're not sure whether we use those as a food source. We don't actually have a word for that particular clam. But we might find that in the dictionary. Maybe the missionaries interviewed someone who could shed more light on that, and we look forward to that. And again, understanding the environment of the rivers. We use those rivers to leave the eastern seaboard. They're going to figure prominently in those archival works, right? So we build our knowledge in terms of our transportation routes, our escape routes, our routes that took us away from the homelands that also bring us back to the homelands, right? Next slide.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, this is for both of us, and also, I think
Sure.
about like what's next. I mean, we would want to do more work at Houghton. We were actually scheduled to do that this week, and Ian and Velma and the institutions very understandably decided this was not the time to travel to the US. But we look about like maybe 5% of the materials. There's just so much more to do. And also now we know that what is in there, we can have a little bit more of a, like a kind of approach about how we keep going about this. You mentioned the place names. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a balance. It's finding that fine balance between, my mom used to say, go outside and have fun because you've been inside too long. It's the balance of being inside and your eyes are going glazy because you're looking at archive stuff, but then you're also making that connection with outdoors, right? Like the rivers, you're making the connection with the plants, the trees, and the community path. That's that important balance where you can root yourself in, I guess, one type of research, but then you're also making sure that you're rooted in the other part and you're making those connections. So yeah, I hope to get outside, as my mom said.
One thing Ian suggested yesterday, which I thought was great, we'll see if this actually happens, was that next time we do some of this, that we'll actually hop into a canoe for a day. So maybe that would be great. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. We're at the end.
Well, thank you, Ian and Anca. That was really great and covered so much territory. And we have some time left for some questions, and I want to invite our attendees here. If you have any questions, you can just put it into the chat or raise your hand on the Zoom function, and we'll glad to call on you if you'd like to just give your question directly. So I had some questions, and you kind of answered some of them in the very last couple of slides too. So, which is a lot about kind of next things you have to work on. I was curious, you shared some examples of like new words like for blueberry or things that gave some small puzzles to figure out, like the word for osprey. I was wondering if you have any examples of words you came across that were like where you did have a word or term for something, you got something totally different and figuring out kind of what to do with that, or some kind of like you had no alternate pronunciation in terms of how it was spelled, or things like that that kind of that come to mind.
Yeah, I would put on the spot here. And this is where Velma would be a great person to have here, because I know that they got to spend some really, like Anca and I did, and I left before Susan and Velma was just there for the day. I'm trying to think off the top of my head if there was something I saw.
I think besides
it's not going to come to me.
Besides the treaty, there were a few words for actually, which I found interesting. I don't remember which ones, but there were a few kinship terms that I think it might have been like grandfather or grandmother. And do you remember this, Ian? Something like that. So like, yeah, there were definitely a few. There were definitely a few where, Ian would be like, oh, this is like the word we use. And yeah, so, and I think with Susan,
it highlights the need to go back.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I also like the comment about Moravians definitely wanting to know the word for blueberry bread, which is true. That being said, I actually looked into how this bread is made, and it's made out of ground ancestral indigenous corn. So it's not a wheat-based bread. And one of my favorite moments in the archive recently was when they complained that like kind of the like white people's corn, right, like which at that point had been through many generations of kind of like growing and all of that was not sufficient for making this kind of bread. Yeah.
Great. I see Ruth has a question.
Yeah, so I've actually done research with Moravian archives too, but at the Moravian archive in Bethlehem. And those archives contained a lot of correspondence. And I'm wondering, and the correspondence was fascinating. And I wondered if you have encountered any correspondence and sort of like what kinds of materials you're looking at and what they reveal in different ways.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. So there's a lot of correspondence, and I look at it quite a bit actually for my dissertation. What's really fascinating, I think, for this talk specifically, is that there are a few pieces of correspondence that are German mixed with a little bit of Mohican or a little bit of Munsee, or in some cases, or lots of cases, they're written in German, but they were dictated by community members and often go to other community members. So there's this like really interesting, what I would kind of call a community of letters that actually happens among Moravians, including indigenous Moravians in the 18th century who kind of scattered along different communities. So there's lots there. And in a way, like it's kind of, you know, there's so much to do. I did just write like a little essay about this coming up for like of the correspondence between Rachel Post, who's a Mohican woman, and Christian Post, who's a missionary. But yeah, there's lots more. So if people are interested, dig into those archives. And I think what would be interesting, kind of actually long term, sometimes they will translate the, you know, that they'll have a letter in an indigenous language, and then they will translate it into German. What would be interesting is to look long term whether or not those translations are actually right, and how are they being translated. But that is just the type of work that is just, I mean, really hard to do, and just shows why we need to keep working at this. Yeah, Ian and I tried a little bit, but it's, yeah, we need some help.
Yeah, you just need to quit your full-time job and just do that as a full-time job.
Yes.
And archival work pays, apparently. I might need some advice on that one.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, so I'll throw in another one, which is just generally, I mean, Ian, perhaps for Ian, is there kind of a formal or informal kind of sense from feedback from community members of like, we're still looking for words for this or vocabulary for this, like stuff to particularly be on the lookout for? I know you have general priorities about land-based terms and things like that, but are other things that come to mind as like to really look for?
Yeah, currently people are really interested in people's names. So for our community, some of that archival work looking at area newspapers, surprisingly, in a very English-dominated part of the province. A lot of the early reporters, when they report on, hey, what's the news in, you know, this small little village or this little town, they include Munsee, Delaware, and they actually recorded people's traditional names. So which then, from a language perspective, you have to break down what their name actually meant. So just an example for everyone, late 1870s, maybe early 1880s, the St. Thomas Journal recorded a huge Thanksgiving dinner that was held out at Munsee, Delaware. But when they recorded person's name who was in attendance, they actually put the Munsee name beside it. And that seems to be very much a big a want from community as they, you know, sort of study their own family history, and they're then able to, I think maybe, you know, down the road they want to reclaim Munsee names, right? So we don't use just our English names when we do our introduction, but they would also like to have a good understanding of what sort of name, you know, has been used in their family before, but also maybe then to bring back those names as opposed to using English, much like other communities.
Great, thank you. Any other lingering questions from our audience? Don't be shy. I imagine after people maybe have a chance to view the recorded version later, they might have thoughts, but we can also pass along questions later. Did someone raising their hand? Or?
I just wanted to say sorry.
Andrea, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I came in super late and missed the whole thing, but I'm really looking forward to watching the recording. And if I have questions, I'm working on 1920s Lenape stuff, so it's a little bit different, but I just can't wait to watch your recording. So.
Great, yeah, we'll be glad to share that with people so people can share it with other folks too.
I was just going to say, kind of about going off on the last question, that if there are community members on the call, I do have kind of a Dropbox where I put certain findings in, and I also have a list that Ian has, like shared some things with in regards to kind of just community priorities. I mean, also talk to, cultural affairs staff and THPOs and stuff like that, but I also have just community members who are like, hey, I would love to find out more about this. And so if I do find something, I'm very happy to share. So please just send me an email if you would want to be part of that, or if you have something that you want to look out for.
Great, well, that might be a good stopping point right there. We'll have a lot of good thoughts and learned a lot of good things here. And so we'll think about it some more and talk to Anca and Ian more in the future about these things, and look forward to hearing about how the research progresses on future visits. And please join me in thanking them for their presentation. And you have any, Anca and Ian, any final words you would like to share or anything? If no, it's okay.
If you're in Lower Munsee Town, Ontario, there is a digital photo or an archival photo opportunity. So if you have family photos and you'd like to document them appropriately, we are hosting a community event. Now, I don't know if anybody on this call's from Lower Munsee Town area, but again, it just sort of highlights the community work that's going on. Nishikwamuen, Lapishkanel.
Great. Thank you, everyone. We hope to see you all again at our next event. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.